Okay, here in Toronto still. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you from an area that has been the site of cosmopolitan and international human activity for over 15,000 years. And we want to honor the relationships forged and ongoing here. This is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe Mississaugas of the Credit and the Ojibwe peoples, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Wendat peoples, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And the territory is a subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, the agreement between Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples to peaceably share and care for the area around the Great Lakes region and all the way up to the St. Lawrence River. So this agreement was violated through several iterations of the Toronto Purchase, starting around 1787, again in 1805, and continuing into the 2010 settlement. And so we're living in and with this violation. So for those of us who are here as guests and uninvited visitors, we want to imagine and practice ways of being good guests, of orienting our work and our priorities in the direction of and in support of those who have cared for this area and these lifeways for thousands of years. So thanks so much to the organizers of the Communication and Media Studies Research Network for asking me to speak today, and especially to Tamsin Gilbert, who I said I've been emailing with for about 2 years to make today possible. I really appreciate all of your hard work. So today I'm going to begin by giving you an overview of my research on the relationship between platforms as media objects for feminists and the relationship to feminist and race politics. And then I'm going to move on to presenting a chapter from my book in progress, which introduces the terms of resistance in a minor key, inclination, and rectitude as they relate to digital culture and specifically to platform media. So my overall research outlines a new media theory, which I call platform feminism, for thinking about the feminist politics of platforms. So it's one that combines feminist media studies, critical race theory, materialist approaches to communication technologies, and what we might call digital platform studies. So I argue that the platform is an overdetermined feminist object of empowerment within popular feminist imaginaries, but also an under-theorized media or technology within digital platform studies. So this term platform feminism accounts for an elevated platform that's become synonymous with feminist action and empowerment. The idea of a raised platform for women, and I want to pause here and acknowledge that this is often a universalizing notion of women, has come to dominate popular imaginaries of what a feminist politics looks like, but also what constitutes feminist digital activism. So let me start with a definition. I consider platforms to be any media object which either physically or metaphorically raise, elevate, and amplify people. This, of course, includes what we commonly consider to be digital platforms, so social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook, but I'm also thinking about physical platforms like stages and pulpits and soapboxes. And my work is challenging some of the main tenets of this growing subfield of digital platform studies, because I argue that within platform studies, there tends to be a focus on the affordances and new sets of relationships that take place on and through various digital platforms. But significantly, the platform is not examined as media, and it's instead assumed to be a broker of power rather than as an extension of power. And so I'm approaching the platform as a medium that structures the political rather than as a surface where the political is played out. And kind of fitting with the theme of the conference, Marshall McLuhan and Harold Adams Innes, their media theories have been so central in my approach to the platform because they provide us with a more expansive notion of what technology is. So in particular, Innes famously developed a theory of time and space bias media. And following Innes, I consider platforms to be space bias media. They facilitate the expansion of decentralized power and adapt easily over time. We see this adaptability by tracing earlier iterations of platforms and recognizing the ongoing effects that they have on sustaining inequality among those who mount them. And so I'm turning to this media theory in order to ask questions about platforms' technicity. So what does it mean to have a media object introduced into our environment that elevates and amplifies? And how has the platform become a condition of possibility for popular feminist politics? So the platform is this medium that appears rather innocuously again and again at sites of struggle, and especially in the digital age. So since 2016, the platform has been especially tied to expressions of what Sarah Banet-Weiser calls popular feminism. For example, the Women's March with its pink knitted hats and its witty signage emerged in 2017 as a symbolic grand counter narrative to the Trump administration. And alongside the march, movements like Me Too and Time's Up are these other expressions of popular feminism that have dominated both popular discourse and scholarship in feminist media studies over the past few years. In 2017, I attended the Women's March in Toronto and followed Me Too discussions in the news. I tracked responses by feminist media studies scholars to these popular movements really closely as well. And as many Black, Brown, Indigenous, and queer scholars and journalists and activists have all since pointed out, all of these events were overwhelmingly straight and white, both in composition, but also in how they were organized. And for me, it wasn't just the megaphones or the Patagonia down-filled jackets or the expensive granola bars and the pussy hats that were straightening and racing these popular movements. And nor was it the fact that Me Too only gained popularity when white celebrities started tweeting that they too had been subject to sexual abuse in Hollywood, even though the hashtag was first used by Black civil rights activist Tarana Burke more than a decade earlier. Instead, for me, it was the role of the platform, an object that significantly mediated all of these events and structured these popular movements in ways that were, I think, being missed upon first glance. So significantly, each of these recent feminist mobilizations has relied on social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. These social media platforms lend themselves to making feminism visible and accessible. Digital platforms circulate news of upcoming marches, and they serve to re-elevate the celebrities and feminist heroes who stand on stages and make speeches to rally the crowd. Feminism through the platform is a digestible type of feminism. What these recent popular examples also show us is that the platform has really reduced feminist politics to simply showing up and making your voice heard. The presence of the platform does the signifying work of democracy in action. It's a democratic veneer for the people, of the potential for social change. An elevated idea or phrase, thought, body, or slogan is the idea of democracy facilitated by the platform, even though we know, of course, that only one person can speak at a time from their place on a platform. And we'll have seen this too in the upholding of what I call platform power during the recent insurrection at the US Capitol and its aftermath, and later in my talk, I'll say more about this. So in doing research for this project, what I found is that what we might focus on instead is how people, and specifically Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, and disabled folks are resisting differently when being elevated by the platform either isn't made available to them or it isn't even their goal in the first place. And this is kind of the most important point of my talk, so I'm going to repeat the sentence. What we might focus on instead is how people, and specifically Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, and disabled folks resist differently when being elevated by the platform either isn't made available or isn't even the goal in the first place. They're still resisting in a technological environment where platforms exist. And what I've found is that they seem to be organizing not with platforms, but in despite of them. So in other words, what my research has found is that for these groups, the political utility of the platform is not assumed. And if there is any political utility to the platform, it's not at all similar to what we see in these popular forms of feminist action, again, what I'm terming platform feminism. Scholars of feminist and class and Black geographies like Doreen Massey and Catherine McKittrick tell us that space has to be negotiated for people marked by race, gender, sexual orientation, class, and disability. This isn't for me just about having an intersectional analysis, but rather it's the very fact that those who live lives as intersectional develop spatial strategies, so everyday methods of negotiating space and moving through the world, as both a response to dealing with institutional rules for particular spaces and for their own survival. So for some, the differential spatial strategies that are emerging are focused on factors like safety, escape, concealment, and care over that of the amplification and popularizing of resistance movements. So this might include things like traveling in groups or choosing to walk on the streets only at specific times of day, setting up protests in places that are proximate to particular locations like police stations or hospitals, for instance. And I think we need to think about these strategies as time consuming and well thought out, not just as minor details. So for example, we might turn toward the indigenous practice of circle dances, which have been performed as part of Idle No More and more recently the Wet Sweat movement around Canada. There's no one body or person out of sync at a circle dance. It's a communal mode of resistance. Amplification and visibility aren't the aim. Or I think of the thousands of South American feminists who have been disguising their faces using bandanas and fabric to cover their eyes during large-scale dance movements that broke out at the end of 2019 in protest of ongoing issues of violence against women. At these protests, participants performed a choreographed dance while chanting the words to a song which in English translates to "A rapist in your path." You can find illustrated video guides that teach each step of this choreographed dance online. And this is a way of ensuring that nobody and no body is out of sync. So this example highlights how a logic of the platform, which is really to make information visible, often must be subverted in order to ensure safety through opacity. So instead of thinking of resistance that's bound to the platform, I'm turning my attention to the corporeal and focusing on tactics of resistance that are actually born out of differential relationships to space. Notably, too, none of these examples place a singular voice or Twitter thread or personal story at their center. So here are a few more examples. In February 2018, at the Blankets for Tina Walk in Toronto, a group of people wrapped themselves in blankets and marched in memory of Tina Fontaine. She was a Sag-King First Nations girl whose killer was acquitted of her murder. The use of blankets at this march was at once a resistance tactic and a symbol for communal care, safety, and warmth. In 2016, members of the Black Lives Matter movement in Toronto camped outside of Toronto Police Headquarters for 2 weeks in protest of the police shooting of Andrew Loku. For those who camped out, the space became one of community healing and building, according to Black Lives Matter TO co-founder Alexandra Williams. These few examples are instances of spatial strategies of resistance that have less to do with amplification or stepping up and more to do with factors related to survival. And as I continue to do research for this project, I'm also collecting archival materials to develop a media history of the platform in order to highlight these uneven effects of platform-mediated visibility, and also to trouble what I see as a neoliberal feminist investment in visibility as a political utility. So for example, we might look at slave auction blocks as platforms. In the American South, slave owners put enslaved Black people on blocks in order to better display their physical features at large slave auctions. And these blocks functioned as media that made people more visible in order to render them legible to power and mostly to make transactions easier. So we see here how the platform's functioning as media that's extending the gaze of power in the people in the business of trading slaves. Or on a lighter note, we could even look at platform shoes to show how elevation is tied to an extension of power. So platform or high-heeled shoes more generally have this history of mediating a popular feminist imperative that sees visibility and elevation as vital to feminist liberation. So shoe designers have really successfully sold us the idea that the platform shoe is a quintessential expression of femininity. And this has been the case since at least 220 BC, when platform shoes have acted as a way of heightening and increasing the visibility of those who wear them. Platform shoes have occupied and continue to occupy a venerated place in our Western cultural imagination. A woman in heels is a woman in power, in control of her body and her sexuality. The platform shoe highlights how a particular popular feminism has an attachment to the platform, and so that we might better consider platforms as a technology of popular feminism, something that can only ever be empowering for those who are already poised to be most visible. So these histories of platforms come to matter for understanding digital culture because we have to look at these material platforms to arrive at a power analysis that shows the total effects of platforms and the ways in which they mediate power. So the differential effects of visibility, historically mediated by material platforms, I think demands a conjunctural analysis. In an age of amplification where we celebrate digital platforms for reinvigorating feminism, we must too look at the lessons learned from the other ways that media requires a particular kind of visibility. So I've so far set up this talk to show you that as part of the amplified stage, digital platforms facilitate increased visibility. But I also want to show you the other side and show you how the quiet resistance of those who do not take so readily to platforms is also being mediated by the digital. And so I use this argument about platforms, feminism, and race in a chapter in my book In Progress. This chapter is called Resistance in a Minor Key, and I've published an abbreviated version as well in First Monday. Saidiya Hartman, in The Anarchy of Colored Girls, Assembled in a Riotous Manner, gives what she calls a speculative history of Esther Brown, a young Black girl living in Harlem in the early 1900s. After working a series of menial jobs, Esther Brown quit working altogether and was charged and jailed for vagrancy. For Hartman, Brown is but one example of the Black women living in emerging American ghettos whose very efforts to survive must be read as radical resistance. Of Brown's riotous life, Hartman writes, but hers was a struggle without formal declarations of policy, slogan, or credos. It required no party platform or 10-point program. And Hartman calls this a revolution in a minor key. Hartman's theory of a revolution in a minor key stands in direct contrast with the relatively new waves of popular protests that broke out in North America and beyond over the past 4 years. While popular feminist movements have really relied on amplification, minor key resistance doesn't register so clearly as protest. It's often restrained, it might be read as dissonant, but it's also quiet and it's based on care. In 2018, I began interviewing different community organizers across North America looking for these quiet modes of resistance. Over the course of 2 years, I spoke with a number of community organizers, artists, and technologists based in different parts of the continent. And next, I'm going to focus on one of the stories from this research. And in this example, what I'm doing is locating a form of resistance and protest by a group whose choice not to amplify shows that digitally mediated resistance and feminist struggle go beyond our recent examples of popular or platform feminism. So example 1, Ghost Ship. In November 2018, I spoke on the phone with Caden Mack, a community organizer based in Oakland, California, who is a trans masculine person of color. As a community organizer and technologist, Mack has co-founded grassroots media startups and really sees the internet as essential for the survival of queer people of color. For Mack, who grew up in suburban Michigan, AOL message boards made connecting with people like them possible. This was a practice that was life-sustaining in their mostly conservative hometown. Mack and I spent most of our time talking about their approach to digital technologies, both personally and professionally, and how they're centered around care and the survival of marginalized communities. In our interview, Mack weighed obvious experiences of online abuse against more joyful and life-affirming moments online before telling me that platforms are a voluntary system of care. And they recalled how relief efforts following a fire at an artist collective made an otherwise careless platform seem like a site of care. So the Ghost Ship Warehouse was an industrial building that served as a work-live collective for artists in Oakland, California. On December 2nd, 2016, the Ghost Ship Warehouse was hosting an electronic music party when it caught fire. 36 people died in that fire, and many others lost their homes and their artist studios. Many of the artists living and working out of that warehouse were queer folks and people of color. And after the fire, those who survived were really in need of life-sustaining necessities. And so in an effort to help provide goods to those who lost their property in the Ghost Ship fire, wish lists were set up on Amazon. And for those of you that don't know, an Amazon wish list documents what items a user has searched and needs, and it's shareable. Others can access the wish list and purchase listed items, which will be then directly delivered to the user who's requested them. Amazon wish lists are increasingly being used by charities that need fast access to specific goods rather than money. And of course, Amazon as a corporation has been subject to so much criticism. And we can think about the devaluation of people working at Amazon warehouses globally, issues surrounding Amazon's customer data collecting practices, their proprietary digital assistant, Alexa, as the latest and most invasive surveillance technology, that its ultra-fast delivery service is contributing to the destruction of the environment. It's also been revealed that Amazon has been complicit in providing software to the US Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, who have used facial recognition and data mining tools to aid in the separation of migrant children from their families. And so maybe this question seems like a bad one, because at almost every turn, Amazon is doing something worth protesting against. And although Amazon's practice and culture are very obviously problematic, I think it's also possible to consider the company's violent way of operating in the same frame as the use for ghost ship relief efforts. So in other words, the case for Amazon wish lists as a site of care does not refute the varied and serious critiques of the site. To name Amazon a site of care is not to disavow the fact that it's also a site of violence. Instead, we might ask, what does it mean to incline toward Amazon? Feminist philosopher Adriana Cabarero's theory of inclination is really useful here. Cabarero argues that vertical posture, or the figure of upright man, has historically, and especially in philosophy, come to stand for an empowered subject. By contrast, the image of a body bent over, inclined toward an object, is a display of vulnerability. To be inclined toward something suggests a weakness, an absence of will to remain upright. For example, she uses Da Vinci's The Virgin and the Child with St. Anne to show how maternal inclination has historically been portrayed in art. In this image, we see Mary sitting and inclined toward baby Jesus. The point here is that the maternal figure is being pulled and against her will toward that which she must care for. So in this case, it's her child. Care here is represented by the gesture of inclining and therefore as a weakness. But the new postural geometry that Cabarero is proposing is one where inclination gets equated with care and where care is politically revolutionary. As Cabarero puts it, inclination could work as a module for a different, more disruptive and revolutionary geometry whose aim is to rethink the very core of community. So a feminist perspective on inclination as a gesture of care thus calls for reading bending not as a weakness, but as a posture that actually sustains community. And so what if activating on the margins might simultaneously mean standing up to and resisting companies like Amazon, but also being inclined toward its unanticipated life-sustaining functions? In the case of the ghost ship fire relief efforts, Amazon was used to facilitate survival. So we have to read this example as a feminist tactic that's centered on inclining toward a site that it of course makes sense to stand against. We have to embrace bending in an age of amplification that seems to measure who's standing tallest. The turn toward thinking about resistance in a minor key is not to discount forms of digital activism that center speaking out. Instead, I'm offering an expanded understanding of resistance grounded by examples of tactics employed by those for whom amplification is not the goal. Sometimes this means refusing normative ways of using technologies. Other times it means recognizing that in the age of amplification that has led to a celebration of platforms as tools for making voices heard, visibility actually becomes antithetical to the survival and care of particular communities. So I'm going to turn now and end this talk by telling you about the direction that my work is going in as I'm trying to account for the moment. Over the past year and a half, we've seen that for many folks, and again, specifically those marked by race, gender, disability, and class, staying alive has really become more complicated. The global pandemic, large-scale Black Lives Matter movements that began in late May 2020, and even the insurrection at the US Capitol earlier this year have all made it increasingly evident that we must think about our strategies for living in the future, and that these are questions we could turn to media and communication studies to help us think through. Last year, at the beginning of the pandemic in Michigan, a group of armed protesters stormed the Capitol carrying guns and demanding that stay-at-home orders be lifted. And since this first protest in Michigan, many similar demonstrations have been carried out across the world. In Clearwater, Florida, a group of demonstrators rallied outside of a courthouse in protest of the state's ongoing shutdown of gyms. The assembly of demonstrators began doing push-ups and squats and holding up placards that read, "Give me gains" or "Give me death." And for me, these recent examples really perversely overemphasize the products of a politics oriented around the logics of platform visibility into rectitude and standing up to and against. They're so clearly not oriented around collective care. Platform-mediated care, though, has also presented itself over the last 18 months in efforts of mutual aid, for instance. The use of digital platforms during this time has been simple and effective. Google Docs and Facebook groups have been set up and widely used to organize mutual aid across the world. For instance, people have organized porch drop-offs of home-cooked meals for those struggling to pay for food in my neighborhood. And even as people began convening again to protest police brutality, there's also been a really notable shift in an emphasis on care and survival. In Toronto, for instance, people attending Black Lives Matter marches wore masks. They passed out pool noodles to help observe social distancing. People passed out gloves and hand sanitizer. But we saw this kind of care at Black Lives Matter protests this summer, alongside a gesture previously tied to Black resistance, that of kneeling, being appropriated by power. For instance, former Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders, Justin Trudeau, cops in the US have all kneeled with protesters for photo ops. During a Raptors game, singer Jessie Reyez kneeled while singing the national anthem and wearing a Breonna Taylor mask from the top of the CN Tower. Watching this, I couldn't help think about what it means for someone to kneel while also being elevated to the highest point in a city. This strips the gesture of its meaning to me, and it highlights why a media theory of elevation is so helpful for understanding protest right now. So these gestures show us the limits of amplification and representation for feminist and race politics. They show us how these are things that so often get appropriated by power. But outside the confines of platform logics, the sort of misuse gets harder. Power cannot so easily appropriate how we collectively care for each other. So I think a study of platform media will remain a really important way to think through this problem. Even this past year has shown us how platforms will continue to dominate media studies scholarship. This is most obvious, I think, in ongoing discussions of what it means to platform Donald Trump, which of media and communication studies scholars have and will rightfully and undoubtedly turn their attention to in the coming years. During this time, though, I've been captured by images that I also think matter just as much for understanding digital culture and platforms and the political. First is this image, which I'm sure a lot will be recognizable to a lot of you by now. It's one of the insurrectionists stealing the House podium. That there was so much outcry from both specific object being taken shows us how the political investment in media objects that bestow the power to speak, shows us the political investment in media objects that bestow the power to speak. Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has of course done much work, wore a censored mask while speaking into a microphone on the House floor. And this was a really stunning moment of a woman who's absolutely not being censored, but actually being given a platform, showing us the limits of platforms and their technical capacity to afford people a voice and the right to speak. Looking at these images, I think we need to ask why and if the right to speak publicly and via the platform, and if deplatforming actually alter our material conditions. Related to this is a second set of images I think we should focus on, and they're of the Black and Brown folks who were tasked with cleaning up the Capitol following the insurrection. My work makes the argument that feminist strategizing needs to go beyond the platform. The underpinning proposition of my research is that feminism must go under the platform, behind it, and recognize the organizing labor, the politics of social reproduction, the intertwining and often at odd demands of care and visibility, and the uneven desires that are obscured by the actual medium of the platform. Is examples of the organizing labor, politics of social reproduction, so often left to Black and Brown people, that have absolutely been obscured by our investment in who has the right to speak. So my ongoing work is to make a case for a feminist media theory of that platform. This is work that will continue to intervene and add to a field of platform studies. And I think platform studies is so rife for intervention because we need to ask new sets of questions about how and where to look for the logics of platform power. Okay, so I'm going to end here and happy to take any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So it's raining very loudly where I am, and I'm hoping you cannot hear it on my roof here, but what I'll first do is pass over to Dewey. I think, Dewey, you had a question, and then we can go from there. Dewey, did you want to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Yes. Hello, Rianka. I'm Julie. And
sorry. Oh, we've got things.
My dentist. Go ahead, sorry.
A reminder.
So this entire research has really blown my mind away. The way you have taken the words and the meaning behind platform to another level. You have actually elevated everything here. And I just want to know, how did you come across the idea of elevating the meaning of elevation to different levels? It really intrigues me. How did you come across this idea?
Thank you for that question. So I started this project as a PhD student, and I started my PhD around the time of the women's marches, and something in attending those marches felt wrong and not they weren't meeting the kind of expectations I think that I thought they would, and I was noticing things like who was standing on the stages at those movements, kind of being this recurring thing that was really interesting to me, who was being asked to speak at women's marches. And then around that time, I also began just observing the way that other platforms were like always popping up in my life. So, standing on a subway platform around the same time that a Sikh woman in London had been pushed off of that platform, right? And realizing that that's another way that being elevated can feel unsafe for specific people. And so the kind of evolution was just noticing the way that platforms kind of seem to repeat themselves in popular culture, and often to differential effects. So yeah, it was like an evolution of just being, I think, observant of the effects of platforms.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. The next question we have is from Chris. Chris, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Sure. So thank you for your presentation today. It was very interesting. And I appreciate the fact that you were looking at groups outside of, excuse the crude phrase, but like white celebrity women, that feminism goes beyond that in platforms. In your studies, did you come across information or findings that you could share with the group in regards to different generations of women? I'm specifically interested in the 40+ age group of women, their view of the current state of feminism versus perhaps a younger generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I wasn't focused on or specifically asking the folks I was interviewing about that. And I will say that a lot of the people, or most of the people I was interviewing, if they were 40+, I didn't interview any 40+ white women in my talk, but in my research. But I do have like a section on Evita, right, which maybe ties into this. So this idea of I have this long kind of reading of how the idea of Madonna at the time standing on her balcony felt so empowering to so many women, which also kind of tied into elevation. And there is this understanding, right? I think in kind of second wave feminism, that being elevated, being made more visible is necessarily a political utility. And I don't agree with that. And I think we've seen how that's kind of been questioned recently. But people who are doing such important work on this are people like Sarah Benet Weiser, who's like so inspirational in pushing back against this idea of visibility in popular feminisms, and has been, really helpful in helping understand, I think that kind of generational change too.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you. The next question we have is, I think it's from Maria Angelis Miranda. Sorry, is it Maria?
Maria de Los Ángeles.
Thank you. Forgive me. Forgive me.
No problem. Thank you, Rianka, for your presentation. I want to ask, digital platforms can give visibility to powerless people, but currently there are too many platforms for too many people. So in this scenario, I want to know which factors are decisive for the visibility of a certain cause or a certain movement, maybe the discourse narrative strategies, maybe the popularity of key actors, or another factor.
Okay, so I think your question is about focusing on specific platforms and what tactics are useful for visibility. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that all platforms are very useful in creating visibility around specific causes. And like, we know that, for example, TikTok has been really effective for millennials or whatever comes after millennials, right? And I think that's been really helpful, but that's not my focus, right? I'm interested in how those platforms might help us do something else that isn't about becoming more visible. And so for that reason, I think it's interesting to focus on something like Google Docs, right? As a feminist platform in some ways, because of the ways it's been used to organize mutual aid. Or we could think about kind of private Facebook groups that get used to help connect people. In Toronto, I talked about that example of Facebook groups, which were helping connect people who needed food during the start of the pandemic when they were losing their jobs. So I think my interest in digital platforms is finding those moments that help people survive more than they help people become more visible, because I think there's kind of limits to platform visibility.
So that is revolution in a minor key?
Yes. Thanks.
Forgive me, I'm also writing notes at the same time because I have some questions myself and things to think through. The next question we have is from Michael. Michael, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question? Or I can read it for you if you prefer.
Oh, I can state it too. Thank you for your talk. It was really exciting to think about the platform in this way, both in the kind of physical sense and the kind of broader metaphorical sense. So I noticed that I think the direction of your work is really focusing on care and mutual aid, which I think is really exciting. So my kind of more side question was, thinking about the topic of no platforming, especially say kind of, for sort of fascists or TERFs or sort of race scientists or something, kind of pushing, finding a way to sort of push people off their platform or deny their platform, and the way that people hand-wring about it, I guess. So I wonder how your critique of platforms complicates that conversation or kind of amplifies, or I guess that's the wrong word. Yeah, I guess adds to that conversation about no platforming in particular.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the way that I've been thinking about this is that instead of canceling people or taking away their platform, what if we tried to just not use the platform in the same way, right? Like, because we see that the kind of methods that we've been trying to use, like deplatforming Donald Trump, aren't altering our material conditions all that much. And so what if instead of also trying to tweet and to be visible in the same way that, you know, Trump is, what if we use these things to do something different and kind of shift the way in which we attend to and approach platforms altogether? To me, I think that's like a much more interesting approach, because I don't know, I think the cancel culture thing is like it's not working. And why are we using the same methods as the alt-right when we could, you know, take up a feminist approach that's entirely different?
So if you have a question, please write your name or the question in the chat. I have a question, but maybe, and I think you kind of already hinted to this with your example of setting up setting up the Amazon wish list and linking that. But my question is, what hope can we see here? I'm always looking for like where we're going to find, you know, the hope. So where can we find hope in the platform? How can the platform be used to help intersect the case for intersectional feminism? Or is it set up in such a way that it only fuels amplification, so it's not going to do that? Is it possible to use the platform? You use that example of the Amazon wish list, which without the intuitive, what seems like the intuitive nature of the platform to amplify. Can you talk a little bit more about that and where we might, where we can see the hope in that situation, in that, because it feels a bit, to me, I'm like, oh, well, then we're in trouble, you know. So yeah. What can be done?
I mean, I hope that the examples that I'm giving here with things like with wish lists and things like mutual aid that we've seen in the pandemic can help us, or at least feel hopeful in some way. Like, I have definitely felt at least some hope in my community, right? That people can care for each other in quiet and small scale ways, and that's maybe our way forward. In that the hope in the platform is maybe also the hope in the fact that people can be, and especially I think people who have had to be creative in the ways that they look to survive, that they can continue to do that with the technologies we already have. So I'm not making an argument for, for example, I sometimes get asked about like, so should we start an alternative Facebook? And no, that's not my argument. I think we can use these technologies that we have and that are, by and large quite shitty, but to do something right productive and orient ourselves around things like care and survival. And the hope also has to be in not thinking about visibility or better representation as the end goal, because I don't think that's going to get us far enough. It's not enough, and we've seen that, I think.
Yeah, and there was something about your talk then that reminded me of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was also it was 10 years ago, but it was an interesting one as well, because there was a lot of, it was 2011, there was still social media and things like that then, and obviously the media was there and they knew about it, but there was a focus on care and people lived there. So it kind of also reminded me of the Black Lives Matter movement outside the station there as well. But anyway, I could go on. We probably have time for another question or two if anyone wants to jump in. I'm not sure if anyone has their hand raised. I'll just have a little bit of a scan here to make sure I haven't missed anyone. Sorry, just looking through the people just to make sure that there's no one with a raised hand or anything like that. Michael has written in the chat, love that connection. Refusal of intelligibility and mutual aid seems to be critical linked forms of resistance. Just a comment. Thanks, Michael. So if no one else has any other questions, what I will do is I will grab the link here if we end this great session and then for some reason you have another question, there is a discussion board attached, and I can pass along those details to Rianka so that if there's questions there, we can ask them later. But I want to thank you for a really fantastic presentation. I wrote a full page of notes while you were writing. As I asked a question about hope, but I did feel inspired to see the potential. I think I got disconnected for a second there. But I think I was just saying, I thank you for, I asked my question about hope, but I do see the potential here. So I just wanted to say that I'm going away with that to see how we can move forward. And thank you again. Apologies for that disconnection there. I hope you can hear me.
It's okay.
Okay. Thank you all. All right. Thank you in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Sorry. I seem to, for some reason, all of a sudden, I think this storm has affected my Wi-Fi here. So unfortunately, I'm hoping you can hear me. Thank you all.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.